Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'll be painting a decorated art shelf. I was inspired by a picture I saw on Pinterest and I decided to make my own interpretation into a painting. So this is the picture that I was inspired by, and what I'm trying to do here is to make sure that the shelf is going to be centered on the page. So I'm just going to draw out a rectangle estimating the size of the shelf, and I try to find the center point where the arch is going to be, and this also makes it a bit easier for me to visualize and create an even arch on both sides. As you guys can see, I'm drawing and erasing a lot. You guys know that I'm not good at this, but I want to train my eyes to be able to do this manually. And this is how I approach it. I just draw by moving small parts of the curve, then erasing and redrawing it into a neater line until I'm satisfied with the shape. Then I'm going to divide up the space into more or less even shelves, and I just eyeballed this after I've divided the space and add another line underneath so I can figure out the thickness of the shelves after the space is already divided into those even sections. Here I also added an inner lining to the overall shape of the arch and add another line underneath or on top of the shelves according to the perspective of the horizon, and then connect the lines on both sides of the shelves. This will create more of a three-dimensional shelf where you can put all your objects in. Finally, I'm going to erase the edges to make sure that the shelves themselves look like they're connected to the wall. Next, I'm going to draw out a few items to decorate the shelves. This is completely up to you. I like to place books, decorations, and plants, as well as framed artwork. However, feel free to fill in the space any way you want. You can look up for more inspiration for decoration ideas or just some ideas of items you can include in your shelves to customize your paintings. But for those of you who want to get straight to painting, I'll of course have the outline of this artwork available in my coffee shop. So here I'm just going to continue to draw on the items. Since the perspective is quite flat, I'm not going to worry about adding perspective to the objects I've drawn out. I'm just going to keep things fairly flat. As an example, to draw on the books, I just draw rectangular shapes for the spine and so on. Since there's quite a bit of space surrounding the art shelf, I'm going to add plants to frame the overall painting. If you don't want to do this, I would suggest for you to draw out the main art shelf larger to fill in more space on your page. Lastly, for the drawing, I just want to lightly erase parts of the dark lines and also to clean out the outline before I start to paint. But before that, let me go over the colors I'll be using. Aquarius Green by Szmal, Terre Verte by Holbein, Yellow Ochre by Holbein, Permanent Yellow Deep by Holbein, Buff Titanium by Daniel Smith, Ray of Grey by Holbein, Chinese White by Holbein, Burnt Umber by Holbein, Vermilion by Holbein, Graphite Grey by Daniel Smith. I'll also be using Bleedproof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. So let's get to painting. I've chosen quite a neutral palette for my items because I don't want them to clash with the pinkish background later. But of course, you can choose your background color as well as the colors of your items you've included. I would say you can get away with brighter tones for the items compared to what I'm using if you opt for a more neutral background for the arch, like a grayish white or a light beige. It's not that it's impossible. As you can see from the reference image, it also has quite a colorful array of items. I just feel like you have to plan it a bit better. For me, I kept it safe since I'm going to paint the background later, so I can't really compare the tones. So if you do want to maybe include more colors, I would suggest for you to either use a lighter color compared to what I'm using for the background, or paint it before painting on the items. As for the color of the items that I've chosen, I use different tones of browns, light browns, gray, and light grays, and it's about just mixing the limited colors that I have on my palette to create those different tones. For some of the pots, I like to add some spots for texture, so the material looks like it's more of a natural stone. To keep with the neutral tone for the plant here, I use a mix of Terre Verde with a bit of Graphite Grey to make the tone of the plant cohesive with the rest of the items. At the moment, these bottles look very light and flat, so I'm adding another layer of buff titanium to add a bit of form by painting on the shadows on the sides and leaving out a bit of negative space as the lightest part of the bottom. To paint them, I use a very light consistency since I want the color to stay light. And as for the second bottle, I added a touch of yellow ochre mixed with the buff titanium for a slight change in tone. For the jars here, I use a mix of buff titanium with gray of gray, and just like the previous bottles before, I'm using a very light consistency. I'm just going to wait for them to dry and move on to paint the base color of the cat, in which case I use a mix of buff titanium with yellow ochre, just like the previous bottle. As for the box case on the right here, I use yellow ochre with a touch of buff titanium to lighten the tone slightly. Everything that I've painted so far are quite light in color, so I decided to include a darker tone. For the jug here, I use a mix of burnt umber with graphite gray, and while I still have this color on my brush, I'm also going to use it to paint the frame on the right. For this pot, I use a mix of yellow ochre with a bit of buff titanium, and I'm going to take a bit of that yellow ochre and mix it with the previous jug color to paint on this vase. Using the same color, I'm also going to paint the frame on the bottom left. As for this next frame, I use a mix of burnt umber with graphite gray in a thick consistency. These next items here are quite random. They're like a wicker ball ornament, so I'm just going to use brown again to paint them. I added yellow ochre to the previous mix of graphite gray with burnt umber, and as for this larger one, I just used a thick consistency of buff titanium. Now that the cat is completely dry, I'm going to go back in using a thin consistency of a mix of buff titanium with yellow ochre, and I'm just trying to paint on the details very lightly on the sides to separate the features like the snout, ears, the head, the body, the tail, and the legs. So after I've painted most of the items except for the books, at least the base color anyway, I'm going to move on to paint the plants framing the shelves, and for this I used a mix of Aquarius green with Terre Verde. After painting a few leaves though, I did feel like the tone doesn't really match with the rest of the items that I've painted so far, but I've already painted a few leaves, so I'm just going to go with it. I would suggest to maybe use Terre Verde mix with graphite gray or some of the browns to differentiate the tone slightly if you were to approach this using the same colors. Personally, I just felt like the Aquarius green had more of a cooler tone compared to the rest of the composition. This is just my opinion though. If you like this color mixture, you can of course use the same. There are some leaves which are overlapping each other here. To paint those areas, I would suggest to wait for the first leaf that you painted to be completely dry before painting the one underneath or on top to keep them separate, or you can leave out a tiny negative space in between so the colors doesn't just blend into each other. For the hanging plant on the right hand side, I'm going to use the same color mixture and the same method of painting. After I finish painting on the leaves, I'm going to paint on the books on the shelves. The reason why I left this out at the beginning is because I wasn't sure what colors I want to paint them with, if I want to just stick with the browns or use a certain hue. I already knew from the beginning that I didn't want to have too many hues clashing with each other for this painting, and since I've already introduced the green from the plants, I decided to just use the green hues to paint on some of the books as accent colors. So for the greens, I tried creating different tones by adding buff titanium or yellow ochre or even browns and things like that, but I'm not going to paint all of the books using green. I'm going to still mix it with some browns and grays. For some of the books, as you can see, sometimes I like to paint on the spine with different designs and colors. Sometimes I like to also position the books the other way around where you see the pages. This is just for a bit of variation. For the books with the page showing, I would just use a thin consistency of buff titanium and then switch to my small brush to paint thin lines at the top and bottom of the pages to suggest the covers of those books. I forgot to paint some of the planters at the bottom here, so here I use Graphite Grey for the planter on the right, and for the one in the middle, I'm just using buff titanium in a thin consistency. Next, I'm going to paint the background of the shelf. I'm going to use a pink color. For this, I use a mix of vermilion, Chinese white, burnt umber, and a bit of yellow ochre. This will create a muted pink, and the reason why I used white instead of just using a thinner consistency is so I can't go over a certain value even if I accidentally piled on too much paint. I mix quite a lot on my palette to have the color readily available so I don't have to keep mixing, since it might be hard to get the exact same tone since I'm mixing quite a few colors here. I then thin out the paint using a bit of water to get a lighter consistency, but since I mixed a lot on my palette, it was a bit difficult to get it to a light enough consistency, so I ended up using a tone that was a bit too dark compared to what I initially had in mind. I just went with it though since I've already painted on, but if this were to happen, you could just add more Chinese white into the mix to lighten the overall color without having to worry too much about using too thick of a consistency when you're painting. Next, I want to paint on the shelves. For the shelves, I want them to be white, but since we can see the top portion and the bottom parts of the shelves, I'm going to use gray since that area is in shadow. For the gray, I use gray of gray with a bit of graphite gray to darken it slightly, and I also mix in a bit of the pink since the pink would likely reflect on those areas close to the color. After that, I'm just going to make sure everything's completely dry before moving on, since I don't want to risk accidentally smudging any of the grays. Next, I'm going to be painting the inner lining of the arch as well as the sides. As for the color, I use the same gray in a thinner consistency. From here on, I'm just going to color in the rest of the elements that I haven't painted. I'm just going to jump around depending on what color I have in mind for certain elements. Here I decided to paint leaves using a mix of graphite gray with Aquarius green. It's completely up to you how you want to fill in these frames. I just tried to paint whatever's easiest, like leaves or abstract images, but of course you can paint whatever comes to mind. For this plant here, I'm using a mix of yellow ochre and Terre Verte, and as for the one on the right, I added permanent yellow deep to make more of a yellow-green. While the surface is still wet, I added Terre Verte and just dotted in certain areas so it doesn't look so flat. Next, I'm going to paint on the hanging plant. For this, I use a mix of graphite gray with Aquarius green. I just use a really dark green here because I want the green to stand out against the background color. I just painted on long wiggly lines and ovals facing in different directions as leaves. For this plant here, I'm again starting out by painting on the stems first, facing in different directions using my small brush. Then I switched to my round brush to paint on the leaves on either side using the same color mixture of Aquarius green and graphite gray. If you don't like this color though, because it is quite dark, you can switch to maybe Terre Verte, but since it's transparent, it will still pick up a little bit of that background color. Since I still have this color mixture on my palette, I decided to use it and outline the previous plant that I painted. I'm also going to use this color to paint on the stems of the leaves that I've already painted so far. From here, I'm going to add on shadows to all the items to make them look less flat. I'm going to start out by painting the shadow of the frame by using a mix of burnt umber and graphite gray. On the jar here, I forgot to paint on brushes, so I'm just using a thick consistency of graphite gray to paint on lines facing in different directions. Then I follow it up by painting the tip of the brush or the bristles in different shapes. I also painted on lines the same way as I painted the brushes using bleed-proof white to suggest aromatherapy sticks, and then I used the bleed-proof white to paint on details on the brushes. For the jug and the vase, I use the same color as the base, and I just paint on a bit of detail like reflections following the cross contour lines, and this will just help enhance the form. I'm also going to do the same for these bottles at the top shelf. For the pot, I'm going to add on some details and textures using a mix of yellow ochre, burnt umber, and graphite gray. And I first paint on vertical lines, and here I'm going to add on some horizontal lines randomly but very close together to create a wicker basket texture. I then added more burnt umber to paint on similar textures on either side as well as the bottom for added shadow. Then using a thin consistency of the same color, I just dotted some texture for the pot at the bottom to make it look like a natural stone. As for these boxes, I used yellow ochre to paint the bottom and let the paint settle before I paint on the top part. I also used the same dark brown mix to create the lock as well as the line to separate the top and bottom. After I added on the shadows of the items, I still feel like it looks flat because it's not interacting with the background and the shelves. So I'm going to add shadows for the background. I just added burnt umber and graphite gray into the pink mixture, and I just paint this behind the displayed objects. After that, I'm going to use bleed proof white to add on some details on the spine of the book, as well as a bit of highlights on the bottles and the vase. And from here, I also realized that I've forgotten to add shadows to the frame, so I'm going to do that. There's going to be a lot of back and forth here, a lot of balancing everything out together. Since I couldn't get some of the lines cleanly, especially for light items, I'm just going to define some of the shape using my Sakura Micron pen in Sepia. This is a 0.05, so it's very thin. And I also use this to just do some scribbles on the side of the book as titles, but I didn't really write anything down. You can write actual titles in if you would like to. And here I also added shadows for the shelf unit underneath the objects. As you can see, I'm not really outlining every single object because some parts I feel is well defined enough with the colors, so I'm only taking parts like this bowl right here. You can see that the background is blending into the item too much, so I just want to define it with the outline. I'm also going to add shadows for the side of the shelves as well using the same gray mixture. Since the leaves are fairly large here, I decided to add a bit of detail by just painting on the midribs of each leaf. As for the color, I use Aquarius green mixed with Graphite Grey and Burnt Umber. I'm also going to use the same color to paint the sides of the leaves here to make them look thicker, and I'm also going to paint on the midribs. This is completely optional, but I decided to add more plants to frame the shelf. So here I'm painting ferns. I'm using a mix of Terre, Verte and Permanent Yellow Deep. And to paint on the ferns, I like to first start out by creating the midrib, which is slightly slanted or curved. As for the leaves, I create these really long wavy lines on either side. While doing this, I am picturing the overall silhouette, and I just connect all the lines together, creating a fern. You can incorporate any type of plants you would like to. Personally, I just want to keep this simple, so for the next one, I just paint on curvy wavy lines with the tip being thinner than the bottom, and I make sure that they're growing from the same space. Here I'm painting the shadows underneath the leaves, and as for the shadow color, I use Graphite Grey with Grey of Grey. From here, I'm just going to balance everything out. If I need to darken parts of the shadow, I'll just go over certain parts again, especially for the shelves because I want the white line to really pop out. For the shadow of the arch, I decided to make the top as well as the two corners slightly darker. And then I just try to blend it together with the base color, and this will just make it look a bit more three-dimensional. I felt like the objects aren't popping out enough, so I decided to add more shadows, and to darken the value this time, I just used a mix of Vermilion, Burnt Umber, as well as Graphite Grey. This time I didn't use the Chinese white, so I can really bump up the value. Since this color mixture is quite dark, I do want to make sure it's blended with the background, so for that I just use a clean damp brush to soften the transition. As final touch-ups, I decided to add some green shadows underneath the plants. I also decided to add a bit more of the shadow color to redefine the corners of the shelves. And that's pretty much it for this painting. I do wish that I started with a lighter pink for the background, but I still enjoyed the process of painting this one, and I hope you guys enjoy it as well. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in my description box. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!